Hello students. In our previous lecture we had already discussed about pollination, types of pollination, that is autogamy, geitonogamy and xenogamy, and also we had discussed about one abiotic pollinating agent, that is wind, that is also known as, that type of pollination also known as anemophily. Now today we will discuss about the remaining agents of the pollination. Now another abiotic agent that helps in pollination is water, and that type of pollination is known as hydrophily. Means when the pollination brings about by water, then it is known as hydrophily. The pollination which is carried out by means of water, then that is known as hydrophily. Not all aquatic plants use water for pollination. That means it is not necessarily that all the aquatic plants exhibits or show the hydrophily. Pollination by water is quite rare. It is quite rare in the flowering plants, and it is limited to 30 genera only. That is, most genera are of monocots. So remember these two important points, that not all aquatic plants they use water for pollination. There are certain aquatic plants like water hyacinth or water lily which are the aquatic plants, but they are being pollinated by the insects or by wind, mainly by the insects. For example, water lily and water hyacinth. Remember these two important examples, that is water lily and water hyacinth. Water lily and water hyacinth, both are the aquatic plants, but they are not pollinated by the water. Both of these plants, that water lily and water hyacinth, they are being pollinated by insects or wind, mainly by the insects. Mainly by the insects. So remember this point, that not all aquatic plants use water for pollination, and the pollination by water is quite rare. Only 30 genera, mostly of monocot genera, they exhibits the hydrophily. Now hydrophily, they are of two types. One is epihydrophily and another one is hypohydrophily. Here epi means above or at the surface, and hypo means below the surface. If the pollination will occur on the surface or above the surface of the water, then that is known as epihydrophily, and if the pollination will occur inside the water, then that is known as hypohydrophily. Now we will discuss both these two types in detail. First one is epihydrophily, that is when the pollination takes place on the surface of water. When the pollination takes place on the surface of water, then it is called epihydrophily. For example, in case of Vallisneria, very important example, it is mentioned in the NCERT, so you should be prepared for the question for Vallisneria. Either it may be short type question or it may be long type question. Prepare it in detail. Now this Vallisneria, it is a dioecious plant. All of you know that what is dioecious plant? Yeah. Dioecious plants are those which in which the unisexual male and unisexual female flowers are on the different plants. So Vallisneria are dioecious plants in which the flowers are unisexual in nature. Now the important characteristic features of those male and female flowers are that the pedicel or the stalk of the female flowers, they are long and coiled. Remember this point. The pedicel or the stalk of the flower, they are long and coiled. But at maturity, due to uncoiling of that pedicel, it will reach at the water surface. The female flowers, they reach at the water surface due to uncoiling of that pedicel. And the male flowers or the pollen grains, they are released to the surface of water due to bursting in the inflorescence. Due to bursting of in the inflorescence of the male plant, the pollen grains, they reached at the surface of water. Now those pollen grains which reached at the surface, they are carried passively by the water currents, and some of them they eventually reach at the stigma of the female flower and achieve the cross pollination. So what will happen in this case, that the pollination will occur at the surface of water. That's why we consider that in Vallisneria epihydrophily is found. All the activities, all the metabolic activities of Vallisneria, they will occur inside the water. Remember, all the activities of Vallisneria, they takes place inside water except pollination. Except pollination. All activities in Vallisneria carried out inside the water, but the pollination it will occur at the surface, at the water surface. See this diagram, this clearly indicates the pollination in case of Vallisneria. This is the first plant. This is the first plant which shows female flowers. These are the female flowers, and this is the Vallisneria plant which shows the male flowers. So this is the male plant, this is the female plant, and this is the male plant. Now this female plant contains the female flowers. These female flowers have this pedicel. This is the pedicel which is long and coiled in nature. This is the pedicel which is long and coiled in nature. Due to the uncoiling of this pedicel, these female flowers, they reached at the surface. They reached at the surface. Now see this male plant. The male flowers, they are compactly found in a inflorescence. These are the male inflorescence. When there will be the bursting in the male inflorescence, these male flowers, they reached at the surface. Due to bursting, they reached at the surface. From these male flowers, pollen grains are released, and finally these pollen grains passively float and reached at the stigma of the female flower and achieve pollination. So the pollination in Vallisneria takes place at the surface or above the surface or on the surface of the water. That's why it is considered as epihydrophily. Now another one is hypohydrophily. Hypo means below, means inside the water surface. When the pollination it will takes place inside the water, then that is known as hypohydrophily. And this hypohydrophily will occur in Zostera, that is the sea grasses, and in case of Hydrilla also. In sea grasses Zostera, female flowers, they remain submerged inside the water, as well as the long ribbon like pollen grains, they are also released inside the water. And finally those ribbon like pollen grains, they are carried passively by water and reaches the stigma so as to achieve the pollination. So in case of Zostera or in case of Hydrilla, the flowers, they remain submerged inside the water, and when the pollen grains are released inside water and float passively towards the stigma of the female flowers, they achieve the pollination. But now the pollination in these cases, in case of Zostera and in case of Hydrilla, they will occur inside the water. That's why we can say that in sea grasses, that is Zostera, and in case of Hydrilla, the pollination is said to be hypohydrophily. Vallisneria and Hydrilla, they are the freshwater plants, while the Zostera, that is the sea grasses, they are the marine water plants. In most of the water pollinated species, pollen grains, they are being protected from wetting by mucilaginous covering. Important that water pollinated, in case of water pollinated species, pollen grains, they are being protected from being wetting by the mucilaginous coverings. So I think you understand that how the abiotic pollinating agents helps in pollination, that is wind, and that another one is water. Now the biotic pollinators, or you can say biotic pollinating agent, in which animal play an important role in pollinating the flowers. So the pollination that is carried out by animals, that is known as zoophily. So when the pollination is carried out by means of animals, then that is known as zoophily. Majority of the flowering plants uses a range of animals as a pollinating agents, because most of the pollination is carried out by the animals or the biotic agents, and amongst them a range of animals or a range of pollinating agents are being utilized for such type of pollination. For example, bees, butterflies, beetles, wasps, ants, moths, birds and bats. They are the common pollinating agents among zoophily. But out of these animals, among these animals, insects and particularly bees are the dominant pollinating agents. Among all these animals, out of these, insects and particularly bees are considered as the dominant pollinating agents. There are certain large animals also which play an important role in pollination or reported as a pollinators. These large animals, they may be some primates, that is lemurs. This is the lemur, that is the primate that helps or that act as a pollinator. Then there are certain arboreal or tree dwelling rodents also. In the second pic, this is the tree dwelling rodent that also act as a pollinator. Then there are certain reptiles such as gecko lizard and garden lizard. They also have been reported as pollinators in some of the species. This is the gecko lizard and this is the garden lizard, which are also act as a pollinators in some of the plant species. So we can say that large animals are also played an important role in the pollination in zoophily. Generally, zoophilous plants, flowers are large. In zoophilous plants, flowers are large, attractive, and they possess the nectar glands. Flowers are large, attractive, and they are having the nectar glands. These are the important characteristics features of zoophilous plants. Often the flowers of animal pollinated plants, they are specifically adapted for a particular species of animals. Remember this, that the flowers of animal pollinated plants, they are specifically adapted for a particular species of animals. Not all animals are responsible to pollinate each and every plant. Only specific animals, they played an important role in the pollination of specific plants. Now, as we said that in case of zoophily, insects played an important role, and that pollination which is being carried out by insects is known as entomophily. Very important regarding exam point of view. The pollination which takes place with the help of insects, that is known as entomophily. So the pollination which is being carried out by means of insects is known as entomophily. And out of this, most of the insect pollination, that is approximately 80% of pollination, it occurs only by means of honeybees. Means honeybee is one of the dominating pollinating agent among the animals. The favorable color of the honeybees is yellow. Means generally honeybees, they are usually attracted towards the yellow color, and they are considered to be the blind for red color. Majority of the insect pollinated flowers, they are large, they are colorful, fragrant and rich in nectar. Then only the insects or the honeybees, they visit those flowers. So the flower should be large, colorful, fragrant and having nectar glands. Then only the insects, particularly the honeybees, will visit the flowers. When the flowers are small, then a number of flowers, they are clustered into the inflorescence. Although the flowers are large, but if the flowers are, they are small in size, then the number of flowers, they are aggregated or clustered together to form inflorescence so as to make them conspicuous, means so that the honeybees or any insect clearly sight the conspicuous inflorescence, clearly visible. Night flowering plants, they are being pollinated by moths. Night flowering plants, they are being pollinated by the moths. Such type of plants, they are highly scented and their flowers are usually white in color. Since they are night blooming or night flowering plants, they are generally white in color and they are highly scented so as to attract the pollinating agent, that is the insects. This is the diagram showing the night flowering plants which are white in color and they are highly scented as well. Now there are certain other flowers which are being pollinated by the flies and beetles. But these flies and beetles, they are attracted toward those flowers which secretes the foul odor. Important point. Flowers which are being pollinated by flies and beetles, they secretes the foul odor so as to attract these animals. These are some pictures showing beetles and flies carried out the pollination, and these beetles and flies, they are attracted to these flowers only because they secretes the foul odor. The pollen grains of the insect pollinated flowers, they become sticky in nature, and that sticky nature is because of the presence of pollen grain. In the earlier lecture we have already discussed about the pollen grain. The pollen grain, which is composed of lipid and carotenoid, is formed by the tapetum cells. Remember that. So that pollen grain is present in those pollen grains which are being pollinated by the insects. Most of the entomophilous plants, they are ornamental plants. Most of the entomophilous plants are ornamental plants. That's why only if the plants are attractive in nature, then only the insects will visit that plant. So the ornamental plants, they utilize their maximum energy in this pollination so as to develop the different types of adaptation for the attraction of insects. So they utilize maximum energy in their pollination so as to attract the insects, and their flowers are attractive in nature. Animals are particularly attracted by color or by fragrance. That's why we can say that most of the entomophilous plants, they are ornamental plants, and insects or the animals, they are attracted towards those flowers only because of their color or because of their fragrance. Now there are some of the following plants which have developed special adaptations for the insect pollination, and one of the important example is in case of bougainvillea. In case of bougainvilleas, flowers are attractive and they are having the bracts. Those bracts are bright and colorful, just like the petals, and those bracts are known as petaloid bracts, which looks like is the petals which attract the insects for pollination. This is the diagram which shows the petals, petaloid bracts. These are the petaloid bracts. Petaloid bracts in case of bougainvillea, and this is the flower. So these petaloid bracts, which looks like petal, colorful bracts, they attract the insects for pollination. So this is one of the important adaptation in case of bougainvillea. Another important example is in a symbiotic relationship in between the yucca plant and pronuba moth. So in case of yucca plant, it develops a symbiotic relationship with a species of a moth, that is pronuba yuccacella moth. In this case, the pollination in case of yucca, it takes place only and only by means of pronuba female moth. So, pronuba female moth, when visits the yucca flowers, they lays down their eggs inside the ovarian cavity, or you can say inside the locule of the ovary of that flower. Means the pronuba female moth, it gets the safe place to lay down their eggs. Means yucca flower helps the female pronuba moth in providing the safer places for egg laying. In return, when they get mature and the larva of the moth comes out of the eggs during the seed development, then those small insects attaches the pollen grains and comes out of that flower and reaches to the another plant of yucca. Means these the small insects of the pronuba moth, they help in the pollination. In return, they help in the pollination. Means it is a kind of symbiotic association or symbiotic relationship between the yucca plant and the female pronuba moth. So the life cycle of both of these, that is yucca and female pronuba moth, they are dependent on each other. Means the life cycle of both depends on each other. Moth and yucca plant cannot complete their life cycle without each other. If yucca plant is not present, then there will be the inhibition of the life cycle of female pronuba moth. Or if female pronuba moth is present, then there will be the inhibition of the life cycle of yucca plant. So that's why this relationship is considered as one of the symbiotic relationship. This is the diagram which shows the yucca plant, inside which the pronuba female moth is present, showing or laid down their eggs. This is the female pronuba moth on a yucca flower. Now there is another case, that is the tallest flower of Amorphophallus. This Amorphophallus flower is approximately 6 feet in height, and the process of pollination in Amorphophallus is also very much similar to that of yucca plant. That it also provide the safe place to lay down the eggs to some of the flies or insects. So a symbiotic relationship is also present in case of Amorphophallus so as to achieve the pollination. This is the flower of Amorphophallus, which is the tallest flower of approximately 6 feet in height. Now there are the floral rewards. That any animal, either it may be insect or large animals, they visit the plant only when they are attracted towards them, and the attraction is either it may be due to color or it may be due to fragrance. Once they reach to the flower, some rewards will be provided by the plant or the flower to the visitor, and those rewards are considered as the floral rewards. So once the animal visit the flower, they either get the nectar or get the pollen grains. So these are considered as the two usual floral rewards. To sustain the animal visits, the flowers have to provide certain rewards to the animals, and nectar and pollen grains are considered as the usual floral rewards. While in some of the other cases or other species, that floral reward may be providing the safer places to lay down their eggs. For example, yucca and Amorphophallus that we have just discussed, that in case of yucca, female pronuba moth get the safer place to lay down their eggs. Exactly is the same case in case of Amorphophallus also. But there are certain insects or the animals which visit the flower of any plant but do not help in pollination. They visit the plant and they receive nectar or the pollen grains from those flowers. So such type of animal pollinators or insect pollinators, they are treated as pollen or nectar robbers. Means many of the insects, they may consume the pollen or the nectar without bringing about the pollination. Means there are certain animals or the insect, they consume the pollen grain or the nectar without help in the pollination, then such floral visitors, they are referred to as the nectar robbers. So I think all these terminologies, that is floral rewards, pollen nectars, have been clear to all of you, and memorize all these things regarding the pollination, agents of pollination, kinds of pollination, all are very, very crucial for board exams as well as for pre-medical exam. Today we are going to discuss yet another topic, that is pollen pistil interaction. As we already discussed about the pollination, when there will be the transfer of pollen grain from anther to stigma, that is known as pollination. So once the pollen grains, they reached at the surface of stigma, then there will be certain interactions among the pollen grains and the pistil. That's why the pistil can recognize the pollen, which may be right type or which may be of wrong type. Then such type of interactions in between the pollen grains and the pistil, that are considered as the pollen pistil interaction. So the pollination, it does not guarantee whether the transfer of the pollen is of right type or it is of compatible type of the same species on the stigma. Sometimes the pollen, it is of wrong type, either from the other species or of the same plant, if it is the case of self incompatibility which lands on the same stigma of the plant. So this type of interactions, when the pistil recognizes the pollen grain, whether it is wrong type or whether it is right type of pollen, then there must be certain interactions in between the pollen grains and the pistil. Such interactions are termed as pollen pistil interactions. Now the pistil, it has the ability to recognize whether the pollen is of right type or it is of wrong type, means whether the pollen grain that is coming on the stigma, it is of compatible type or incompatible in nature. So if it is of right type, then the pistil accepts that pollen. If the pollen grain, it is of right type, then the pistil accepts the pollen grain, and thus it promotes the post pollination events or development, that is the fertilization. See this diagram, this shows that these are the pollen grains and these are reaching over the stigma. So once these pollen grains, they reaches over the stigma, and if stigma accepts those pollen grains, then such type of pollen grains, they are of right type pollen. These pollen grains, they are the right type, or you can say compatible pollens. And if they are considered as the right type or compatible pollens, then these pollen grains, they are accepted by the stigma, and after that it promotes the post pollination events or development, that is the formation of pollen tube, which finally enters inside the ovule. So this is the case when the pollen grain reaches over the stigma, treated as right type or compatible pollen. But there is another case also, that if the pollen grain, it is of wrong type, then the pistil rejects that pollen. If the pollen grain which reaches over the surface of a stigma is of wrong type or incompatible in nature, then the pistil rejects that pollen, and thus this will prevent the pollen germination on the stigma, or you can say it inhibits the growth of the pollen tube in the style. So the ability of the pistil to recognize the pollen is the result of continuous dialogue between the pollen grain and the pistil. So this pollen pistil interaction, this is considered as the ability of the pistil to recognize the pollen whether it is of right type or wrong type, and this power of recognition is the result of a continuous dialogue in between the pollen grains and the pistil. So this continuous dialogue in between the pollen grain and the pistil, it is mediated by the chemical components of both pollen, which will interact with the chemical components of the pistil. Means this continuous dialogue in between the pollen grain and the pistil, it is because of the chemical components of both pollen grains and the pistil. This is the diagram which shows the wrong type of pollens reaches over the stigma. It is a case of self incompatibility which we have already discussed. For example, if these are the pollen grains which reaches over the stigma, and such pollens, they are the self pollens of this stigma, but this stigma treated them as incompatible in nature. Means the stigma rejects those pollen grains. Once these pollen grains, although they are the self pollen grains, but they are being rejected by the stigma, then it will inhibit the pollen germination over the stigma, or you can say it will inhibit the formation of pollen tube inside the style. So this is the case of wrong type or incompatible pollen when comes over the surface of stigma, and that incompatible or wrong type of pollen is being rejected by the stigma or pistil. So we can say that all those events starting from the deposition of the pollen grains on the stigma until the pollen tube enters inside the ovule. This is very important, that from where to where pollen pistil interaction events will be considered. Then you must say that all those events starting from the pollen deposition on the stigma until the pollen tube enters inside the ovule, they together referred as the pollen pistil interactions. They are referred as the all these events, they are referred as the pollen pistil interactions. As we have already discussed that these pollen pistil interactions are due to the chemical components of both pollen grains and the pistil. So we can say that pollen pistil interaction is mediated by the chemical components of both pollen grain as well as pistil. So pollen pistil interaction, it is a dynamic process involving the pollen recognition followed by the promotion or the inhibition of the pollen germination. It is only in the recent years that botanists, they have been able to identify some of the pollen and pistil components and their interactions, leading to the recognition followed by acceptance or rejection. And the knowledge gained in this area would help the plant breeders in manipulating the pollen pistil interaction even in incompatible pollinations so as to get the desired hybrids. So as we are discussing about the sexual reproduction in flowering plants, and the sexual reproduction in flowering plants comprises of some of the events which includes pre-fertilization events, fertilization events and post-fertilization events. Pre-fertilization events we already discussed in our previous lecture. Now is the turn to discuss about the second event, that is fertilization event. So what do you mean by the fertilization? As you all know that fertilization is simply the fusion of male and female gametes, that is known as fertilization. So we can say that the fusion of male gamete and female gamete is called the fertilization, and this process of fertilization is being completed into certain steps, and these are the 4 steps. The first step is germination of pollen grain, second is the entry of pollen tube inside the ovule, then third step is the entry of pollen tube inside the embryo sac, and fourth step is finally the fusion of male and female gametes, that is the fertilization, actual fertilization. So we will start now here the fertilization processes, that is, first event is germination of pollen grains. In the previous lecture, in the development of male gametophyte, we discussed that there will be the pre-pollination development and post-pollination development, and that post-pollination development starts when the two-celled stage of the pollen grain reaches over the stigma, and that is pollen grain when germinates over the stigma, that is the post-pollination development of male gametophyte, and finally the male gametophyte is being formed. That is just similar case, that is the germination of pollen grain. That after the pollination, when the pollen grains they reaches over the surface of stigma, those pollen grains they germinate on the stigma. Once the pollen grains, when they reaches over the stigma and they germinates, they absorbs the moisture and sugary content over the stigma or from the stigma, and it will swells up. As it will swells up, the volume of the pollen grain increases. Due to the increase in the volume of the pollen grain, that will exert the pressure over intine as well as over exine, and because of this pressure, the intine, it will come outside from any one of the germ pore in form of a tube-like structure, and that tube-like structure is known as pollen tube. So we can say that intine of the pollen grain, it grows or it comes out through any one of the germ pore of the exine in form of a tube-like structure or outgrowth, which is called as pollen tube. So here the question can be asked that what is pollen tube? You just simply said that pollen tube is nothing but the extension of intine in form of a tube-like structure. Now there may be the two cases, either in most of the plants single pollen tube is being formed, or in some of the angiospermic plants many pollen tubes may form. So if one pollen tube develops, for example in case of Capsella and in most of the angiosperms, then such condition is said to be monosiphonous condition. So what is monosiphonous condition? That if one pollen tube develops, then that condition is known as monosiphonous condition. Here the siphon means the tube-like structure. We are concerning about the pollen tube, so that tube-like structure is the pollen tube in this case. So monosiphonous means the single pollen tube when develops, then condition is monosiphonous. But if in some of the plants more than one pollen tube develops, then the condition is said to be polysiphonous condition. For example, in case of Malvaceae family, for example like China rose, and in Cucurbitaceae family, that is the cucurbites, watermelon, etc., these belongs to the Cucurbitaceae family, then such condition is said to be polysiphonous condition, that is when more than one pollen tube develops in a plant. So remember both these conditions, either one pollen tube or many pollen tubes may develop in the angiospermic plant, but the usual case is monosiphonous, that is single pollen tube develops in most of the angiospermic plants. This pollen tube, it produces certain enzymes. These are the enzymes which will degrade or digest the tissue of the stigma as well as the solid style. Then only the pollen tube gets the pathway so as to reaches till the ovule. So how the pollen tube digests the stigmatic tissues or the solid style? By means of the enzymes. These enzymes help in digesting the stigmatic tissues as well as the solid style so as to develop the pathway for the pollen tube and reaches that pollen tube towards the ovule. Now when the pollen tube comes down from the stigma into the style, then first of all vegetative nucleus, or you can say tube nucleus, enters. So which nucleus will enter inside the pollen tube when the pollen tube enters into the style? That is the tube nucleus or the vegetative nucleus. Then later on generative cell also enters inside the pollen tube, means First of all, vegetative nucleus enters, and then this is followed by the entry of generative cell inside the pollen tube. Now the tube nucleus, it occupies the terminal or apical position of the pollen tube. Vegetative cell, or you can say vegetative nucleus or the tube nucleus, it will attain the terminal position in the pollen tube, and this tube nucleus, which is present at the terminal position of the pollen tube, it controls the growth of the pollen tube. This is very important, that which nucleus controls the tube growth or pollen tube growth. Then answer will be the tube nucleus or the vegetative nucleus controls the growth of the pollen tube. Meanwhile, the generative cell, which is also present inside the pollen tube, it undergo mitotic division, means it divides mitotically and it forms the two male gametes, and both of these male gametes, they are non-motile in nature. They are non-motile in nature. Now there are certain chemicals which also control the growth of the pollen tube, and these chemicals are boron and calcium. Among these two chemicals, mainly boron is responsible, or mainly boron is essential for the growth of the pollen tube. Now the growth of the pollen tube is also controlled by the temperature, means certain optimum temperature is required for the growth of the pollen tube, and that optimum or best temperature for the growth of pollen tube is 20 to 30 degree Celsius. Since the main role of controlling the pollen tube growth is vegetative nucleus or tube nucleus, and that tube nucleus is present at the terminal or apical position of the pollen tube. That means the growth of the pollen tube is apical in nature, means the pollen tube shows apical growth. These are the pollen grains which are reaching over the surface of the stigma. So this diagram shows that after pollination, when the pollen grains, they are reached over the surface of the stigma. Once these pollen grains reached over the surface of stigma in a two-celled stage. Two-celled stage means the vegetative cell and the generative cells are formed. And once these pollen grains, they reach over the surface of stigma, they absorb the moisture and sugary content, and due to this, the volume, it will increases. Due to the increase in the volume of the pollen grain, it will exert pressure over the surface of intine as well as exine, and due to this pressure, this intine, this is the intine, this is the intine, and this intine, it will comes outside in form of a tube-like structure, and that tube-like structure is known as a pollen tube. This is the exine and this is intine. So because of the pressure being developed due to the absorption of moisture and sugary content, this intine, it will comes outside through any one of the germ pore in form of a tube-like structure, and that tube-like structure is known as pollen tube. Now as soon as this pollen tube is formed, first of all, this tube nucleus, it will attain the terminal position of this pollen tube. So this tube nucleus, it is present at the terminal position. Soon this generative cell containing this generative nucleus is also moving towards the tube-like structure, that is pollen tube. Now this generative cell, it will undergo mitotic division and forms the two non-motile male gametes. This is the diagram which represents the longitudinal section of the flower showing the growth of the pollen tube. These are the pollen grains which reaches over the surface of stigma, and they germinate and give rise to the pollen tube. And this is the pollen tube which secretes the certain enzymes and degrade the stigmatic tissues and the solid style if present. Then that pollen tube get the pathway and reaches inside the ovule, which is essential for the growth of, which is essential for the fertilization process. Now under laboratory condition we can easily demonstrate the germination of the pollen grain also. How? Then we can easily study the pollen germination by dusting some of the flowers such as pea, chickpea, crotalaria, balsam, vinca on the glass slide that contains the drop of sugar solution, and that sugar solution must be 10% sugar solution. And if we observe after 15 to 30 minutes, when we observe it, that slide under the low magnification power of the microscope, then we found certain pollen tubes which are coming outside from that of the pollen grains. So it is a simple demonstration which can be performed under laboratory conditions to easily understand the germination of the pollen grain. These are the diagrammatic view that so we conclude this lecture now. In this lecture we study about the agents of pollination as well as the pollen pistil interaction and the first step of fertilization, that is the germination of the pollen grain on the stigma. The remaining steps of the fertilization we have to discuss in our next lecture. Thank you.